Well, last week we left off with the Jews there, the remaining two tribes that were there in the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, being carried away into Babylonian captivity. And tonight we're going to pick up our study in the book of Jeremiah, and we're going to begin in Jeremiah chapter 40, and then look at a few of the following chapters tonight. Well, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar annexed that area that had been Judah into one of his Babylonian provinces. And he selected a man by the name of Gedaliah and placed Gedaliah as the governor over that region. The Bible tells us that Gedaliah was not from the kingly line of David, but he was of the descent of one of those two tribes. Well, Gedaliah, he attempts to restore some sense of civilization. Now, you remember Jerusalem has been completely destroyed. The temple is in ruins. All of the houses and buildings have been destroyed. But we find that prior to it being destroyed, there were quite a few of those who had lived in that land who had escaped. And generally it's believed that after each one of the waves of the Babylonians coming into Judah and carrying people away, there would be an exodus of people who would leave. After Babylon would leave, you would have an exodus of Jews who would leave. And they would go and they would essentially hide out in some of the neighboring countries. Well, after Gedaliah is named governor over this new province, he sets out trying to gather those people back together. He tries to get them to come back and to establish some form of civilization there in that land that had been Judah. Well, after a short time, there was a man by the name of Ishmael. Now, this is a different Ishmael than the son of Abraham. But there was a man by the name of Ishmael who actually had descended from David. And most scholars believe that he believed that with himself being a descendant of David, that he should have been the one selected to be over that province. He believed in this line of succession. And so he felt that Gedaliah should not have been the rightful leader. And so he gets 10 strong men together to ally themselves with him. They go and they attack Gedaliah. And they put Gedaliah to death. And the text tells us that Gedaliah, when he was put to death, that he had a group of Jews there with him. Well, not only did they put to death Gedaliah, they put to death all of the Jews that were in his company. But then we find that over the next few weeks or months, Ishmael and these 10 men, they set about trying to purge that land. They viewed all of these Jews that had submitted to Gedaliah's leadership as traitors. And so they went in and they were trying to purge that land. And one of the commentators that I looked at said that this was an early Holocaust, essentially. They were going in and trying to wipe out that whole race of people that remained in that land. But there was another man who rose in prominence. And we read about this man in Jeremiah 43, verses 4 through 7. His name was Johanan. And Johanan, he gained the respect of the Jews who remained in that land. And he came up with a plan that they would escape and they would go into Egypt. That they would essentially abandon the land of Judah. And they would go and they would hide out in Egypt as long as it took for things to settle down. And then they would restore some type of normalcy to their life. Well, Jeremiah, he steps in. And as we read there in that chapter, Jeremiah chapter 43, Jeremiah tells them very plainly that that's not a good idea. That they did not need to flee to Egypt. That if they did flee to Egypt, that it was going to turn out bad for each and every one of them. And he says, if you flee to Egypt, of course I'm paraphrasing, he says, if you flee to Egypt, one of three things is going to happen to you. Some will be taken captive, will be made slaves. You may remember in a previous lesson I talked about the fact that many of those who remained in Judah eventually became enslaved to some of those neighboring countries. He says, some of you will die in battle. But then he says, there will also be some of you who will be taken as prisoners of war and you will be executed by the sword. Do any of those three things sound good? No. And so Jeremiah has warned them, if you follow Johanan and you go to Egypt, one of these three things will happen to you. Well, as we continue to read, in Jeremiah chapter 46, we find this punishment carried out when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army invade Egypt. And the main group of people that they attacked were these Jews. They go into Egypt, many lose their lives, many become slaves, and many were also taken as prisoners of war and executed. So once again, we see the prophecies of God coming to fruition, coming true. But for those in Babylon, life was quite different. But it wasn't all that difficult. They were surrounded by a foreign culture. They were in a foreign land. And while they were forced to live surrounded by this heathen culture, they were allowed to retain much of their national identity. They were able to retain many of their practices, their customs, and they were able to retain as many of their religious rituals and practices as they could observe away from the temple. For you may remember, under the old law, there were many of their rituals that could only be observed in a certain way with certain people, and some of them you had to be at the temple in order to carry those things out. And so, of course, being in a foreign land, being away from the temple, they weren't able to engage in those things. But they continued to practice what they were able to practice. In Psalm 137 and verse 1, we find the psalmist describing kind of the emotions that they felt while they were there in Babylon. It says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. So as they thought back to Jerusalem and they thought to the temple and they thought what had been left behind and destroyed, it was a very trying time. It was very emotional for them. But although this was an emotional time, although they weren't able to carry out their faith to its fullest, they did the best they could. They retained their faithfulness as closely as they could. But something that I have found quite interesting as I've been studying these periods in history, this time, while they were in Babylonian captivity, was the period of time when the Jews really began to develop this strict adherence to what's now known as rabbinical law, the interpretations of the rabbis. It was during this time when they were surrounded by heathen culture, but yet they were trying to practice as much of their faith as they could. This is where they really became focused upon, interpreting the old law and figuring out how they could engage in those things as closely as they could. And so they began to be very strict in their adherence to what the old law set forth. And we find that many of the things that we see the Jews practicing during the time of Christ, if you trace back Jewish history, many of those things came about during the time of Babylonian captivity. And so it's a very interesting time in the history of the Jewish people, and it really helps us to understand more so of why they developed this mentality that they did, why they placed so much emphasis upon their traditions. It was because they were in a land where they could not engage 100% the letter of the law. And so they were having to develop new ways of celebrating many of these rituals and practices. And they were doing this, trying to be as close as they could to God. But something else that I found quite interesting as I was studying this period of time, it was during this time when they were in Babylonian captivity when this line of demarcation between Jew and Gentile really became a strong point. You know, we've seen, as we were studying the kings, there were a lot of times when they would interact with neighboring countries and ally themselves with neighboring countries. After the Babylonian captivity, they kept to themselves. They developed a very strong personal national identity. And so you really don't find them interacting with Gentiles much at all. And this, as I've mentioned also in a previous lesson, is where many people believe that term Jew originated as they began to hold themselves back from many of the rituals and practices of the Babylonians. The Babylonians came up with this derogatory term for the people of Judah, and they came to refer to them as Jews. And this was a term that, caught on, and they continue to use that term even to this day, those who follow the modern equivalent of the religion known as Judaism. But while they were in Babylon, there were several famous events that took place. And we're not going to do a real in-depth study of these things because most of these are events that, we can remember hearing about as children. They're going to be events that are quite familiar to us. But I want to give just kind of an overview of some of the things that took place during that 70-year period when they were in Babylon. Now, most of what we know about that period of time, we read about in the book of Daniel. Starting from the very beginning of Daniel, we find in Daniel chapter 1, as soon as the first wave of exiles arrived there in Babylon, those young people, in Daniel chapter 1, we see where they are given the finest food in the land, the food from the king's table. What was the problem? It was unclean. It did not fit the dietary standards of the old law. And as we talked about in a previous lesson, we remember somewhat the contest that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego developed. And over time, they would see who was healthiest following whichever diet. And you remember those who remained faithful to God, who followed their clean diet, they were much healthier at the end of that period of time. Then we move on into Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar declares himself worthy of worship. And declares that people are to bow down and to worship him. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being faithful to God, they refused this idolatrous adoration. They would not worship Nebuchadnezzar as a god. And so, the punishment that was handed down was they were thrown into a fiery furnace. Well, you remember, they were spared. Whenever Nebuchadnezzar went and looked into the furnace, he saw a fourth figure, and he said the figure was like a son of God. Now, that's led some to believe that it was actually Jesus walking around in there. But I think that the evidence supports itself more so as this was some type of angelic being. The text tends to lend itself more so to a divine being rather than actually the Son of God as we would think of Jesus. And so they were spared. This led to an official decree of acceptance. Not necessarily a decree that the Babylonians were going to worship the God of the Jews. But it was a decree, much like what took place in the first century with the Romans, a decree that the Jews were more than welcome to engage in their religious practices. It was a recognition of the worship of the God of heaven, that it was acceptable among those who were in Babylon. And so for a while, they are able to worship with freedom. They don't face any type of persecution from the king. There was an acceptance of God in Babylon. But then Nebuchadnezzar passes away. And as we move into Daniel chapter 5, a new king by the name of Belshazzar becomes king. Well, Belshazzar, the text tells us everything that Nebuchadnezzar had learned about God, everything that God had revealed to him, the text says Belshazzar forgot all of that. He didn't respect any of it. So he throws this big feast. And if you read what the text tells us about this feast, I think the best way that we could describe that was it was quite a lewd occasion. It was an occasion where a lot of indecency, a lot of sinfulness, a lot of sexual immorality, and a lot of idolatry was taking place. It was a true hedonistic occasion. But in the midst of all of this, suddenly a hand appears. Now, some argue that this was the hand of God. The text does not tell us whose hand this was. But this hand begins to write on the plaster on the wall of the palace. And it's written in a language that the king and his wise men are not able to interpret. Well, the king is about to go stir crazy, not understanding what's taking place, not able to understand what this message is, or able to find anyone that is able to give an explanation for it, when suddenly his wife remembers something that had happened during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. She goes to her husband and she says, "Now, wasn't there a man among the Jews who interpreted some dreams for Nebuchadnezzar? Wasn't there a man who was able to come and do these great things? Why don't you call for him?" So Belshazzar, he calls for Daniel. And Daniel comes, and the message that he brings is a pronouncement of doom upon Babylon. Because he tells the king, he says, "You have forgotten everything that Nebuchadnezzar learned about God. You have brought in the gold and silver vessels from the temple and used them in your debaucherous activities here in the palace. You have desecrated these holy things." And then he gave the message. "God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." So simply put, God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to rise in power. God blessed Nebuchadnezzar in many ways, because so long as Nebuchadnezzar was taking care of the Jews, protecting them, allowing them to have freedom, that nation of Babylon continued to grow and to thrive. But then Belshazzar comes to power and he throws all that out the window. And so the message is this. It says, God has seen your actions or your lack of action. You've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting. You're not living up to the standard that you need to be living up to. And as a result of this, and this is kind of the way that I look at this, King, you may not realize it, but your nation has already fallen. God has already taken this nation from you, has divided it, and is going to turn it over to the Medes and the Persians. Well, after this, we see in Daniel 5, verses 29 through 31, even after this terrible message that's brought, it says, Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, which was another name for Babylon, Chaldea was another name for Babylon, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now this is where the history gets a little fuzzy. Gets a little confusing. There's some disagreement in the timeline moving forward at this point. And the reason for this is because Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1 talks about the fact that Cyrus was the Medo-Persian king at the time that Babylon fell. But if you look at what's stated in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 31, who does it say was the king? Darius. Now, from what I've read, the most logical way of interpreting what we see here is that the very night that this message was delivered by Daniel was the night that the Medo-Persian army under the command of Cyrus came in, attacked the city of Babylon, killed Belshazzar, and took control of the nation. But moving forward, how do we justify when one passage says that Cyrus was king and another passage says that Darius was the king? Well, we have to understand the ins and outs of the Medo-Persian Empire. This was not, at least in the early days of the empire, this was not just one nation. These were two separate nations who had allied themselves together. And so what you had was Cyrus, who was king of Persia, and you had Darius, who was king of the Medes. They had allied their two nations together. And what many of the historical sources that I've seen would say is that Cyrus was more the military leader. He was the one that was leading the army. He would go about, he would conquer the nations, he would bring them under Medo-Persian control, and then he would hand that control off to Darius or to a lesser ruler. And so generally, what I personally believe, based upon what I've studied from this, I think that what took place was that Cyrus came in as the military leader. He came in, he conquered Babylon. He's the one that kind of set things in order. But then as the military leader, he was always on the move, seeking to conquer other lands. And so after being in Babylon for a short period of time, Cyrus moves along and he hands off leadership of Babylon to Darius, to his counterpart, his fellow king. And Darius then would take care of the diplomatic issues and the restructuring of the nation and all of that. And so this, to me, makes the most logical sense, because ultimately we're going to find a very important thing took place in that short period of time when Cyrus was there leading that nation. And we're going to talk about that more in depth when we get into our next lesson. But as we continue looking at kind of this historical timeline that we see here, there are some who believe that eventually Cyrus came back and he took over leadership of that nation. But I've not been able to find anything in the Bible or in the historic record that gives accurate evidence to support that. In fact, there's some evidence that says that Cyrus actually was killed in battle shortly after the conquering of Babylon. But we find ultimately Darius was the one who was going to be the man on the scene. He was going to be the main leader. He was the one that was going to carry that nation forward. Cyrus was the conqueror, and Cyrus was the one who issued the decree that the Jews could go back home. And ultimately, well, we know through the providence of God, that was God fulfilling his promise that they would be able to return. But really, whenever it came down to it, to Cyrus, he really didn't care what happened to those people. These were foreigners in this land that he had conquered. If they wanted to leave, that was well and good. If they wanted to go home, that was just fewer people that he had to try to assimilate into his culture. And so he made the decree. Now what we're going to find is that it would be somewhere between 3 to 5 years after that initial decree was made before the first group of Jews would finally leave and head back to Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that once again a little bit more as we get into the next lesson. But it was during the reign of Darius, but prior to the first group of Jews leaving, that probably the best known event from the time of the Babylonian captivity took place. King Darius recognized Daniel's leadership capabilities. and he appointed him to a high-ranking government position. Now, there were many others who didn't like this. They disagreed with that choice. They didn't feel like Daniel should be having that much power when he wasn't a Mede or a Persian. But nevertheless, Daniel had gained the trust of the king. So they decided that they had to try to find a way to either discredit Daniel or find some way that Daniel would not have the same degree of power that they were going to have. And so they go and they play off of the king's pride. They go to the king, and this is in Daniel chapter 6 and verse 9. They go and they propose an idea. They start out by issuing these great messages of praise. You know, you're such a wonderful king. May you live forever. They said, but we've got an idea that's even greater than that. Why don't you issue a decree, and this is just going to bring more praise to you. Why don't you issue a decree that says for the next 30 days, no one can pray to anyone but you? Essentially, place yourself in the position of a king and of a god. No one can pray to anyone but you. Well, we find out the reason why that's the tactic that they used was because they knew that it was Daniel's practice to pray 3 times a day facing toward Jerusalem. They knew that Daniel was a righteous man. They knew that he would not go against his God. Well, Darius, like I said, his pride got the better of him. And he issued this decree. And in this decree it stated that if anyone was found praying to anyone other than King Darius during that 30-day period, they were to be cast into a den of lions. Well, Daniel no doubt hears the decree. But I don't believe that he even for a second entertained the thought of going along with the decree. Because when it came time for him to pray at the time that he had set aside, that prescribed time, he continued with his practice. He continued doing what he knew was right and what was pleasing to God. Well, the men who opposed Daniel, they saw him praying. Well, what do you think they did? They went and tattled on him. They immediately went to the king and said, King, you know this guy Daniel that you like so well? He's denying you. He's worshiping somebody else. Well, at this point, Darius knew he had made a mistake. At this point, he came to the realization that his wisdom had been lacking. And this decree was not wise. So he does not immediately pass judgment. And the text tells us that he stayed up all night. He could not sleep. He was agonizing over the decision that he had to make. Well, the next morning, those men that were seeking to do away with Daniel, they were there waiting. King, you know what the decree said. Are you going to keep your word? Are you going to go along with the punishment that you said was going to take place? Well, Daniel, all along, Daniel knew what he was facing. He knew that the decision of the king probably would not go in his favor. And we find his betrayers essentially forced the king's hand. And the king passed judgment. He ordered that Daniel was to be thrown into the lion's den and a large stone was to be placed over the opening. Well, once again, Darius spent another sleepless night. As we would say today, he was worried sick. about Daniel. So early the next morning, he goes to the lion's den, not knowing what he's going to find. He removes the stone that was placed over the opening, and he shouts down to Daniel. And to his surprise, Daniel responds back. Daniel was okay. For he tells the king that an angel of the Lord had come and had stopped the mouths of the lions. He had not suffered a single injury. Well, Daniel was pulled out of the lion's den, and then Darius commenced to execute judgment on Daniel's accusers. All of those men and their families were cast into the lion's den, and they were swiftly killed. But then I want you to notice Daniel chapter 6, verse 26. King Darius made a declaration. He said that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? From this day forward, Daniel lives about 2 more years after this event takes place. And during that 2-year period, the Bible tells us that he enjoyed a time of prosperity. He lived a good life those last 2 years. But Daniel never left Babylon. For we find that Daniel passed away about 2 years prior to the first group of Jews leaving Babylon to go back to Jerusalem. Does anybody have any questions or comments? We've only got about 2 minutes left, and I don't really want to go into our next section, but does anybody have any questions or comments? That's really where I wanted to get tonight. But if anybody has anything, like I said, we've got just a short period of time left. Any questions or comments?
I thought you will be ready on your part.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll stop right there. And Lord willing, next Wednesday night, we're going to pick up in Ezra chapter 1. And so if you want to go ahead and be studying ahead, Ezra chapter 1 is where we'll begin next Wednesday night.